Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Dick. It's a good-looking crowd out there. I'm glad we circulated that false rumor about the free bar tonight, because I can tell it paid off. Well, I am very, very proud of my father, United States District Judge Jerry L. Buchmeyer. He was a great civil rights judge. He changed the history of North Texas and of America in several different ways. He had cases that impacted minorities, people who were seeking equality, people whose voices were not heard in any other forum, in the area of public housing, in the area of representation in the city council, and several big First Amendment cases. There's almost no part of our lives as citizens of Dallas and Texas that Dad's civil rights cases did not touch. And yet at the end of his life, when we were able to talk to him and he reflected back upon his legal career, he said on many occasions that he felt, without a doubt, his greatest contribution as a jurist was the Baker versus Wade case. I know a lot of you in the audience knew my father, and besides being a fantastic judge and a person of great moral value, he was hysterical. He was one of the funniest people you would ever have known. For 28 years, he wrote a humor column for the Texas Bar Journal, which I've inherited in some small way to do honor. And as I speak to you tonight, I know that he would rather that I reflected to you his sense of humor than his deep sense of knowledge of the law. So I think what would be more entertaining for us is to hear some of the family stories about Baker versus Wade, about now that Dad has passed, what his feelings were about the case. Those feelings might not have been appropriate while he was still living to be public conversation. And what it meant for us in the family, especially for me as his lesbian daughter, and for my brother, his gay son. He had 2 for 4 of his kids were gay. You know, he was born in 1933 in a small town in East Texas, Overton. I've always heard people say, my parents can't change. They grew up, you know, in a different era. Well, my dad grew up in the Jim Crow South and lived deep segregation, and yet became one of our great civil rights leaders. And if he can do it, I know all of us can do it. He was nominated by Jimmy Carter in 1979, confirmed by the Senate back when that wasn't a nightmare to get done. He took the bench. I was a young woman in college, not even out to myself. And when the Baker case was one of his first cases as a judge. And those cases are assigned by random assignment. And when these smart lawyers, Mike Anglin and Dick Peoples and Lee Taft, they didn't know what judge they would get. And when they got Jerry Buchmeyer, they didn't know who he was. I mean, they thought perhaps some of the information they had about his personal life, that he was a liberal man, but they really didn't know if they had a chance of setting aside centuries of discrimination against homosexual people. And this is a story that Mr. Don Baker told me himself, and that Lee Taft has told me too. They got to the courtroom on that day in August 1982 to hear the decision. And they were nervous. You know, there was no telling what would happen. And Mr. Baker opened the door to the courtroom and he saw my brother. Because just as Dick mentioned, my brother's 12 years old and Dad took him to court in a real spiffy Brooks Brothers outfit, little gray trousers and blue blazer. He was looking good, a little tie. And Mr. Baker opened the door and he saw my brother and he said to Lee, "My God, we've won. We've won this case." And Lee said, "How could you possibly know that?" And Mr. Baker said, "The judge brings his son to court to see history made." Wow. And that was exactly the fact. People will ask me, did my father know that he had 2 gay children when he made that decision? I think think he had a pretty darn good suspicion. That's what I'm telling you. I know I got in trouble more than a few times for stealing Dad's collection of Playboy magazines. And my brother was one of those children who probably has a pretty good idea when they were young. So I'm going to say now that, yeah, Dad knew what was going on. And as Dick mentioned in the opinion, Dad expressed so much respect for Mr. Don Baker. And I'm so glad tonight you're going to hear from my good friend Maggie Watt, who is Mr. Baker's sister, to hear more in depth about what an incredible individual he was. But I can recall my dad sitting with me and summarizing the testimony and telling me how deeply, deeply impressed he was with Mr. Baker. He also, as Dick mentioned, about the witnesses for the defendant, dismissed them out of hand as buffoon and fools. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that Dr. James Grissom, who testified at that time that homosexuality was an illness and a disease and a behavior deviant and that it should be criminalized in order to protect society, that is the same Dr. James Grissom who we all know now as Dr. Death, who testified 100% of the time in death penalty cases that every single defendant deserved to be put to death. His license was revoked in 1995 by the American Psychiatric Society, but I think that, and many people would agree, was decades too late. And there's a popular documentary about that man. That was who the defendants found to testify in Baker versus Wade. Also in the case, Dad was very, very much amused by Henry Wade's deposition. Henry Wade is, some of you may be new to Dallas, but he's a legendary district attorney for us. Mr. Wade did not want to give that deposition at all. He had a lot of good, important things to do, and a misdemeanor statute that was never enforced was not on his list. So in the Baker decision, and for people who aren't lawyers, if you want to see any of these big decisions, I recommend you go to openjurist.com. You'll easily find them. But Henry Wade's deposition is quoted by Dad at length too in the Baker decision, and I want to give you just a little taste of that right now because I think it's kind of funny. Question to Mr. Henry Wade: can you explain how this law furthers the state interest in decency? Henry Wade: no. Question: can you explain how this law furthers the welfare of society? Mr. Henry Wade: no. I'm going to paraphrase this and wait for the answer. Mr. Wade, if sodomy is permitted for straight couples but prohibited for gay couples, can you explain how this law furthers the state interest in procreation? Mr. Henry Wade: I don't think procreation is involved in either one of them, is it? That is a direct quote from the Baker versus Wade opinion, as written by my father. But his ruling was revolutionary at the time in a way that I think it is so hard for us to remember. But what some of my favorite lines in the decision are: homosexuals are not ill. Homosexuals are not mentally diseased. They are not criminals. They have no propensity for crime. The absence of 2106 would not lead to increased crime. It would not lead to increased violence. It would not lead to other threats to public health or safety. The plaintiffs had a fundamental right of privacy as consenting adults in their own homes. Now, what happened after the ruling? I'm going to talk a little bit what happened at the Dallas Morning News. I'm going to talk a little bit of what happened in our family. The case was reported by the Morning News. Page 1, a very small story at the bottom of the newspaper. And then the very next day, and I know a lot of you are going to remember this fellow, Dallas Morning News Associate Editor William Murchison. Do I hear some boos and hisses? A notorious conservative of the day had an op-ed opinion that went viral for the time. It was so much quoted and republicized. The name of that article was "What's So Gay About It?" And he wrote, saying gay people want the privilege of being as gay as they please, mind you, not gay in the traditional sense of blithe and merry, gay in the contemporary sense of homosexual. The thought is not blithe and merry at all. And then a day later, the Dallas Morning News had in their main editorial opinion, wrong decision. U.S. District Judge Jerry Buchmeyer's ruling is being compared to the Declaration of Independence. But, and they went on at some length, a homosexual policeman would be judged by most community members as an unfortunate role model. Likewise, a homosexual teacher. But my favorite Dallas Morning News article of that time, and let me say that some of the letters to the editor that they printed by today's standards would have been terroristic threats. Threats of retribution against Mr. Baker, against my father, against the attorneys and the activists that were involved. It was violent. But my favorite headline appeared over a collection of letters to the editor, and the Dallas Morning News chose this banner: homosexuality, pro or con? But what happened to our family and what happened to Dad after the decision? Dad was newly single, and he moved to a condo in Turtle Creek. Rumors went wild. Only a gay man would live in Turtle Creek. Only a gay judge would have handed down a decision like Baker versus Wade. And Dad compounded those rumors because he discovered that coffee spot I know we all loved, That Special Blend. And Dad was convinced That Special Blend was the only place in town to provide good quality coffee. He was down there 3-4 times a week. That's on the crossroads, folks, right there at Throckmorton and Cedar Springs, just a block from where we are now. Another funny thing about Dad right then was when the case was handed down and decided, the reporters would call the courthouse and call his courtroom and say, how can we get a copy of the decision? How we can get the copy of the decision? And he said, and he thought this was hysterical, you can go down to the government printing office here in the basement and pay a fortune, or you can go to the Crossroads bookstores where they're mimeographing them and selling them hot off the machine for half the price. And I understand Crossroads bookstore paid the rent for 3 months off of copies of that. And Dad felt he had sent most of the business that way. So the rumors were crazy that Dad was gay, and he could care less and didn't pay any attention. But sometimes I kind of wonder. About that time, my 3-year-old daughter, my youngest, decided that she was only going to use the female pronouns, she and her. In her book, there was only one gender in this world. And I wasn't going to correct her. I mean, who would, right? She called my father Grandma Jerry. And it stuck. And Dad loved it. And for the rest of his life, he called himself Grandma Jerry. He signed that name, Grandma Jerry. Every note, every card, every package, every gift. He never gave it up. We still call him that today when we remember him. And I think there was a little part of Dad, that little gender nonconformity tweak, that he got the biggest kick out of his grandparent name. In 1987, and this would have been 2 years after the matter was settled, that's important to the lawyers in the room, Dad spoke to an evening banquet at the Dallas Gay Alliance. I understand it was a wonderful night, a fundraiser, and he gave a marvelous speech. The very next day, the haters in our community filed a grievance accusing Dad of misconduct and filed that with the Fifth Circuit. They accused him of conduct unbecoming a judge, for standing up in a room of gay people and speaking to a room of gay people. They accused him of permanent bias for doing the same thing. You would think and hope that maybe the Fifth Circuit quickly dismissed that grievance complaint. They did not, and it hung around for many, many years. I would like to say that I think during the onsetting years were difficult for my father. He had 2 gay children, myself and my brother, and he watched us experience the same discrimination that Mr. Baker explained so heartfully in his courtroom in 1982. He saw me get a divorce from my husband and go into Dallas family law courts as an open lesbian woman with an adopted child. He saw me be fired from a job. He saw my brother denied housing. These are things that happen to every gay person in this room. They're not dramatic. They are every day. But I think for my father to see it, knowing that he had hoped in some way to change that. Now, what did my brother and I respond? We teased him forever. Dad, thanks for trying to decriminalize our lives. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It didn't work. We're thinking maybe more allowance would help. One time I took Dad to a PFLAG meeting. He was the invited guest. And I'm not sure if I was his escort or I was Exhibit A, but I was there when he spoke to PFLAG. And Dad had gotten it into his head that the very lovely and gentle people of parents and friends of lesbians and gays wanted a detailed briefing on the Texas homosexual conduct law. He decided he should read it to them, and you may have noticed that the other speakers have sidestepped around the word sodomy, and they've been more gentle, talking about intimate relationships. But when laws are written about sex, they talk about sex. So Dad is at the podium, and he starts reading this. Deviant sexual intercourse means any contact between genitals of one person and the mouth or anus. I'm in the back of the room going, Dad, no, stop. And in a minute he sees me and says, oh, never mind. Also about that time, Dad got extremely mad at the Texas Bar Association. He got so mad at them, he wrote the hottest letter I've ever seen. I know because a copy came to me, CC Pam at the bottom of the letter. That's all I knew, CC Pam at the bottom of the letter. The Texas Bar Association had voted down and denied the right of a group of lawyers to have a subsection. It's kind of like a study club of lawyers on the issue of human rights and LGBT issues. On the same day, they approved a section for animal rights. Dad wrote off that hot letter. Dear Texas Bar Association, today I am ashamed to be a lawyer in the state of Texas. My daughter Pam is a wonderful lawyer and she happens to be a lesbian, and you guys don't know what the hell you're doing. I get the letter, I call him up, I say, Dad, technically, before you out someone to 120,000 lawyers in the state of Texas, you might let them know in advance? And he said, oh, never mind. Baker versus Wade was not Dad's only gay case. Baker versus Wade was not his only case that dealt with sodomy. In 1988-1999, Dr. Robert Jeffries of the First Baptist Church of Wichita Falls was shocked and appalled to find books in the children's section of the Wichita Falls library, Heather Has Two Mommies and Daddy's Roommate. I heard a tidbit on this story just tonight, that news made NPR, our own Professor Bill Bridge of SMU Law School here, heard it on NPR, called John Haraney here, a native of Wichita Falls, and said, John, you've got to do something. And John did, and jumped into the middle of this case. And won it. Dr. Jeffries preached at his pulpit long and hard about all the evils of homosexuality. I think maybe we were in good company, though, because he also said Oprah Winfrey was a tool of Satan. He convinced, through a lot of lobbying, and I'm making a big story very short, he convinced the city council to pass a, John, what's the term? Unauthorized words? It was an ordinance. And it was called the Objectionable Books Ordinance, right? And if 300 carriers with a library card signed a petition, a book could be removed. They wanted it removed to the trash can, but they finally got a neglected shelf where nobody could ever find it. The librarians claimed censorship. And Dad agreed with them right down the line in an important civil rights case, a First Amendment case, that is still cited often today. And again, as I said, John Harani, who's right here, gets all the credit for that. Dr. Robert Jeffries may be a name that's familiar to you because he left that First Baptist Church in Wichita Falls and came to First Baptist Church here in Dallas, Texas, and launched the Gay Is Not Okay campaign in 2008. And I personally know that Dr. Jeffries here in Dallas was responsible for a number of very talented and wonderful LGBT activists who came out as a response to his efforts. I loved that case. I loved the case about Heather Has Two Mommies, because I've got 2 daughters, and my daughters call my wife, Shellie Crandall, Mama number 2. So 21 years passed, and as I told you, Dr. Grigson, Dr. Death, lost his psychiatric license. The Danny Hill, who was the district attorney from West Texas, who inappropriately was able to maneuver an appeal of this case, had a DWI charge, facing the end of his political career with a terrible drinking problem, committed suicide. Anita Bryant had a divorce and was disowned by the radical right. I think we, as gay folks, muddled along for those 21 years, as best we could. After all, we're always survivors, aren't we? The Lawrence case, June 2003. And all the sodomy laws in the United States are done away with. That was when the U.S. Supreme Court said, you know, I think Jerry Buchmeyer was right. I think Jerry Buchmeyer had it figured out 21 years ago. I went to Lee Park that night with a lot of people to celebrate, and I wept. I cried. And what did my dad think? My dad had stroke-induced dementia. My dad had Alzheimer's. He died within 90 days. He was not cognizant. He never knew a day in Texas when his children were not criminals. But it probably didn't matter, because Dad knew he was right on the law, and he knew he was right on the U.S. Constitution, and he knew he was right on the arc of justice. He knew that justice would eventually happen. And I don't want to end tonight on a sad note, because I know that he wouldn't approve. One of the things he would insist on me telling you tonight is that even though the judges get a lot of attention in these big cases, that is not appropriate. The plaintiffs, the attorneys, the activists, they are the brave people. He just realized what the law really was. Those are the people who put everything on the line. Mr. Don Baker, Lee Taft, Dick Peoples, Mike Anglin, Harriet Earhart, James Barber, and many, many more. I also thought I would share with you a very happy story, a funny thing Dad would do. He loved to perform same-sex marriages. Got the biggest kick out of that. And he had the cleverest line. He would always say, by the power that should be invested in me. And then he would say, now the bride may kiss her spouse, and then the brides may kiss the judge. Okay, Dad had a remarkably profane, off-color joke about Baker versus Wade that I cannot deliver from the podium tonight. I tried to work up my courage, and I just can't. If you want to hear it, you've got to catch me in the back when the camera's not rolling. We're also looking forward to a Judge Buchmeyer conference room at the new Resource Center building, and I do need support and assistance with that project. If anybody wants to catch me, I'd love to talk to you about that too. I am so deeply proud of my old man. I miss him every day, and I'm very proud to have had this opportunity to speak to you tonight about him. Thank you all.